And here we go. Let's create this new project. So we're going to have our main toolbar, just like any software program, where we have File, Edit, Assets, Game Objects, Components, Windows, and Help. So there's always more than one way to do something, and one of them will be through the menus up here at the top. Next, have this toolbar, which changes in every version. They've made multiple changes, but this is typically where you're going to see, at least in the middle, the play button, where you can play test your game, pause, and step. We have the hierarchy. This is a list view of the assets that are actually in the current level called sample scene. And we have a main camera object here. Oftentimes, if you create a 3D game, you'll also have a light. Now, when I select that in our scene view, you'll physically, or not really physically, but virtually see the camera right here with the defaults. This is our actual scene view, and we'll go over moving here in a second. But with that selected, we've selected it in the hierarchy. In the inspector, you will actually see what makes this a camera. It's called the main camera, which is the typical default name. And we get a bunch of settings here with our camera on it, which we'll go over here in a second. So back to the scene panel. Here we have some tools, a little toolbar in here. This can be docked up at the top, or now you can move it around and dock it in different places. But typically you have the hand tool to just kind of pan up and down or left and right. We have the move tool, which will give you the, for a 2D game, X and Y coordinates for us to move the camera if we wanted to. We have the rotate tool, and there are also shortcuts. Typically W is move, E is rotate, and R is going to be our scale. Now we don't want to scale anything yet, but you can, there's multiple ways to move, rotate, and scale. So we have W, E, and R. Okay. Then we have the rect tool. Very popular for 2D games. We don't have any 2D objects yet, but it kind of makes it easier to rotate, scale, and move all at the same time. And then we also have the transform tool, which is also similar. Some new things about that, but that gives you all of them. You've got the move, scale, and rotate here. There's also another one that's not on the toolbar where you can custom edit and do some more intermediate level things. And then we have our viewport. So that's kind of the movement of the scene view. Our viewport, we have across the top all our settings here for our scene or level where we're going to build our game. So we have these two setups for our alignments. We have the grid settings, which axis is the grid on and is it viewable. You got the drop down arrow for more options. So if we wanted to reduce the opacity or bring it all the way up, you could snap it to different axes. Right, a different axis. And we have our grid snapping, turning it on or off. The arrow, which will give us more options for the settings. So we have our grid size currently. We want to use that, just 1 as the default. But we can align as well here. Then we have the increment settings, increment snapping, so that we can turn our increment. So what do you want to snap, the rotation or scale, or when we're moving things as well? That's for increment. We have a bunch of these that you can go over. You can just hover your mouse over them to see what it is. So you know, oh, this will toggle the audio on and off. So sometimes you want to check if you're like, is the audio not working? Well, maybe it's off here. So we want to check that if that's something, right? We have hidden things. We also have turning their gizmos on and off. But also, you can see there's an arrow drop down with additional settings. So we can make our 3D icons bigger or smaller. Just like if we want to fade the gizmos as well, which can kind of depend on where you're at in the scene. Now, to actually kind of move around, the shortcuts are going to be pressing the middle mouse button down will actually give you the hand tool, right? The scrolly wheel will let you zoom in and out. We have, if we were in 3D space, we're currently in this 2D view. So even though we're in 2D, I can click this 2D button in here and it'll give us the 3D look in the 2D space. And here I'm going to hold down Alt and left drag. So I'm holding down Alt and just kind of dragging around the view. So you kind of got to do that a few times to get used to it. So on your own, test that out. You can also still use the scrolly with holding down Alt or Option if you're on a Mac. And then if we hold down Alt and we right click, it'll also give us that zoom, which will give us a smooth zoom. So Alt and right click will give us that smooth zoom. So now this is currently, because our camera is orthographic, although we're kind of in a perspective viewport at the moment because we're in 3D space, and you can see perspective right here. You can also click these buttons here to kind of maneuver around for viewing. And for all intents and purposes, since it's a 2D game, we're just going to turn 2D back on so it'll snap to our 2D view, okay? Now our inspector shows us elements for our camera, and we get these deals where we have the solid color for the camera, and we could change that color. So if we wanted to make this more of a dark gray or something, we can just change the color here, and what the camera is going to see is black. Now we have additional settings if this is going to be a perspective camera or orthographic, and we have our size, clipping panes. Now, if you change this to perspective, you get different options because the perspective camera has a field of view. And if you change the field of view too much, it actually can cause like one of those weird sicknesses, make you feel nauseous and all that when you're playing the game. So you got to be careful for how much you change the field of view. So let's go back to orthographic camera, or if you're just watching and you're just following along, you don't have to really change anything yet. We are in the scene view. We can see what the camera sees right here, but when we play test, it's going to go to the game view. Now the game view is what the player will actually see, and it's looking through the camera. Now currently it'll show you here, there's game view, there's also simulator, which we'll use for like cell phone devices and tablets, but we're just going to leave it on game. If you have multiple displays, right, picking a display here, and we have free aspect. Now free aspect just means as we change this, the alignment are changing. So what we want to do is set this to 16:9, specifically for if we're making games for computer monitors, right? We're going to have typically that widescreen 16:9. Now we would change this if we're doing, say, like a cell phone, where we might have that 9:16 aspect ratio to get that. But for right now, we're just going to do 16:9. So now it'll shrink in no matter how big I make my window. This area will always be 16:9, and it doesn't just change just because I'm dragging my window around, which I hadn't gone over yet. Now you know each of these that are separated by a kind of dark gray black line, we can actually move these around. And if you happen to mess these up where you pull a bunch out and you're like, oh my goodness, we can just come up here to our kind of toolbar here to the top right, and it's set to default, and we can do just reset all layouts. And this may look different depending on which version of Unity, but there'll be some sort of reset. So we reset that, it's gonna restore, click continue, and everything's back to normal. And they do have other layouts here as well that you can use, or we can even save our own layout. But for right now, the way I like to do this is I'll usually bring my game view, drag it, and you'll feel it snap. You can see here, if I just got it right here, I'm dragging it. As I get closer, it snaps. So now, pause the video and do that. Then, once you're done with that, you can drag this line here so you can get where you like it at. Now, it says no rendering because it's currently display 2 on accident, so I'm going to change that back to display 1. And you can see because I reset the default, see how it's weird aspect ratio? I'm going to change that from free aspect again back to 16:9. So now it has that regular aspect ratio. And then before we kind of leave this top area in our sample scene here, one of the things I can do is create a sprite here. So in the hierarchy, I can click either the plus symbol, or in this blank area, I can right click and I can go to 2D object, sprites. Now, used to be they didn't have templates. You just created a sprite 2D object and then you would have to assign the sprite. But now they have sprites already by default that you can do a square sprite, circle sprite. And this is still great just for white boxing, kind of making a template for your level. So maybe I'll just grab a square and you'll see it names it square. And then over on the right-hand side in the inspector, we have our transform component and our sprite renderer, which we haven't quite talked about yet, but let's go over that for the interface. So all game objects will have a transform component. If I click the main camera, it also has a transform. If I click the square, right, it has a transform. But what makes this a sprite game object is it has a sprite renderer. And you can see the sprite is the square, which is provided by Unity. And we can change the color of this square. Say I wanted to do a greenish square. If this was a piece of art that we wanted to flip it, we could potentially flip it. There's specific things for draw mode. And we'll go over looking that up here shortly. Like, what is that? What about mask interaction and sprite sort point? Those are things as we get more into the art side of it. And then we have a material, which everything is going to have some sort of material. This is for sprites, so it's a sprite default material. And then we have some additional settings. These sorting layers are going to be very important later on because for a 2D game, we look at each of the 2D objects by the sorting layer. And we also have order in layers. So you can think of it as almost having like sub-layers inside one layer. So our default, we could do multiple numbers here for having the order inside that layer. So we can grab our move tool and you can see if we just put our arrow on the red, we can move this over. And if we drag up the green arrow, it will only let us drag up. So try that. Now let's say I want to move both. I want to move it diagonally to the opposite side. So watch me first. I'm going to go to this blue square in the middle here and drag to the corner and let off. So you try that. You want to get comfortable with moving things around, and you can go ahead and try the rotate. Now, the key here is you don't want to just click in the gray area because it can get all kinds of funky. You can see it's it's rotating like where you almost can't see it. So I just messed up the rotation. I've moved it out crazy, and I don't want to waste time trying to get it back to the way it was. So a shortcut would be we go to our transform component here. You can see these will minimize and collapse. So our transform component, and we can click the arrow or the title, and you can see all these numbers are messed up. Now there's 3 ways to really go about changing the position, and one of those being we could type it in, but we could type in 0, 0, 0. But if we had to do this for 70 different game objects, that would be really painful. So one thing that we need to learn to do is for the transform component, we'll click the 3 dots here. And this is the menu for the transform component, also known as the vertical ellipse. And we're going to click that and do reset. And this will reset all of them. Now I'm going to press W, grab the X and Y and move it over here to this corner. And you can see if the scale is a 1 by 1, it perfectly fits 1 square. So if I made this a 2 by 2 and moved it, it perfectly fits what would be 4 squares, but would be 2 on the X and 2 on the Y. So that's our grid is using the same units of measurement as the scale, rotation, and position. So now let's say I accidentally forgot and I messed up the rotation here, and it's all kinds of crazy. So what I want to do then is I can go to my transform, and each version of Unity might have it slightly different, but inside the menu is going to be a reset rotation. So that way I don't mess up the scale and I don't mess up the position. I just want to reset the rotation. So I'll go to that 3 dots and then I'll go to reset property and reset rotation. Boom. Now all of that is going to be extremely important later on as you're going through and you're putting together the art for your game. Now I can do Control S, or on a Mac, Command S, but if we go up to File, each version of Unity again is going to have a different way, but you'll see Control S right here is save. In some of the other versions, it'll be save scene or save scene as. And it's the same thing though. Each version that they've kind of changed things up, Control S, save, and save scene are going to be the same thing. It's saving what we have here, where we've moved a green sprite and we moved it over. Now we can rename this 2 ways, right? We can, in our hierarchy, we could do a slow click, and then we could rename it here. We could also right click on it and do rename. We could select it and go to our inspector and rename it. So let me call it green box. Now, in our project window, this is where we store all of our files. So right now I don't have anything, but we're going to be downloading some soon. But this is where you might put your audio files, your art, your effects, right? All your different file types and data for your game you're going to save here. This is actually saved on your computer. Wherever your Unity project is saved at, you're going to have this assets folder, and we even have this scenes folder created for us, which has a sample scene right here. That's our sample scene that we're working in. Now you can tell I haven't saved based on right here. The sample scene, it has an asterisk for it. We have not saved. So I'm going to do Control S or Command S to save, and now it's saved. You want to make sure you don't have any other windows open, because if you accidentally clicked on something else, the Control S might not be activated or work. So you want to check for that asterisk to make sure it actually went through, so you're good to go. So we save that. Now right now we don't have anything in here, but there are a couple different ways to view this, and down at the bottom corner here we have this slider that we can drag to make it just an icon with the name, or we can drag to make this bigger so that we can actually see our thumbnail better. Everything is going to have some sort of thumbnail, and in this case our sample scene is just going to have this special symbol for scenes. So some of them will have a special thumbnail, but other times if I drew a block, it's going to show the picture of the block, right? So we'll click on our assets folder, and you can see now the scenes folder here. Off to the right of that, I'm going to right click and create. You'll notice there are a lot of things we can create. We're going to create another folder. Now literally, since this is on a Windows computer, I am creating a Windows folder. So Unity's connected with Windows. When I create this folder, it's also on Windows. It's on the computer. Now we're going to name this scripts. Okay, and you notice the icon will change from different versions of Unity, but one thing I like is when it's got this inlay, and that is because there's nothing inside of it, but we do have something inside our scenes folder. So we know our scripts folder is empty. At the bottom here, you'll kind of see that URL or that address where you can see we're in the assets folder, and then we're selected the scripts folder. If I double click that, you'll still see, but at the top it'll show assets, and then we went into our scripts folder. I can easily go back by just clicking here as well. But I could also click over here. So there's all these different ways that you can get to it, whichever one you like. But we're going to get in the scripts folder, and in here I'm going to, instead of right clicking, just show you another way. Instead of right clicking and then do create C# script, we're actually going to do the plus and then do C# script. Now, I want you to watch first before you do this step. So this one can cause some problems if we don't name our script correctly the first time. So when I click this, you'll notice, look at my screen, it is highlighted in blue and it's called New Behavior Script. Don't click off. Instead, I'm going to right away type and I'm going to say hello. So that's what we're naming the script. Because when I type in hello, the name of the file is also going to be put inside of the script and it's going to show as a public class and then the name. So I'll show you that here, but we can click enter or click off now, but it's named hello. So we want to name that correctly. Now, if you mess that up, don't rename your script. If you didn't name it correctly the first time, like I showed you just now, I just don't want you to right click rename. Don't do that right now. Instead, you would just delete by pressing delete on your keyboard and just recreate that C# script again and name it properly. Now, with that created, over on the right hand side, you will see that it gives us a preview of our script in the inspector. You'll see here it shows that this is an imported script. So even though we created the file has now been created in the Windows folder, and then we can see a preview of the code. So this is what comes with that script by default. And so now that's kind of the basics of that. I think the last window we haven't talked about is the console. Now with the console, this is where we're going to be using for troubleshooting. So when you misspell something, you mistype something, you get some sort of error, whether it's for spelling, capitalization, punctuation, or some other error, right? This is what we're going to use to troubleshoot it. Now, in the console, it will display messages, warnings, and errors. Messages are useful for when we're troubleshooting and we're wanting it to print a message or show us a message. The warnings are kind of letting you know, like, hey, maybe this could be a problem. Just letting you know this, this thing. And then there is the stop sign, which is the errors. Now we can turn these off. So depending on if you click on them or not, it will basically hide those. So something to come back to that later. You notice I get the menu or the vertical ellipse here for the console as well, where I can click that and get additional options inside of this menu. So last but not least, I want to leave you with a special tip on how to learn about some of this on your own by just looking at the wonderful documentation by Unity. So let's go to our green box. We're going to click on that, and you can click on it whether it's in the scene view or in the sample, the hierarchy. But either way, we select our green box. We're going to go over to the inspector. And one of the things that you can do is each of these components you'll see has a circle with a question mark in it. This is going to open the reference documentation for that component. And we didn't quite describe this, but every game object, you will add components based on what you want it to be or what its behavior or task is. So the camera, what makes this a camera game object is it has a camera component. So if you're like, what the heck is an audio listener component? We could simply click this question mark and it's going to pull up the documentation for that. You can see here it gives you some hints about it, the details and properties for that. And this is for the manual. This gives us information about the components or specific things in Unity, but there's also the scripting API. This is going to be the tools for coding, how you might want to code something, say for the audio listener or other audio components. So if I go to my green box and then the sprite renderer and I click that handy dandy question mark, you will see here, now we have information about the sprite renderer. And we scroll down and it's going to go over what does flip do? What is material? What is draw mode? Specific things that are going to be very important to go over later on. So the draw mode, we have like sliced. What is sliced? Oh, there's this 9 slice. What is that? You can click on that and it'll give you more information. You also have information about the sorting layers, right? And mask interaction. And there's some handy dandy pictures here as well. And they're always working on improving the documentation for every version. So this is going to change every time they release a new version. As they update, they will have that listed up at the top for different versions. Even though it's 2023, right, the most current stable version is actually in 2022. So eventually when we get into 24, right, they'll have a stable version for 2023. So fun stuff with that too. But anyway, some really interesting things here to kind of look at that we'll also talk more later on. And that is the basics of the interface. We're going to go over more tools and tips and tricks and how to do specific tasks in the next videos.